Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise, but the first edition of Warhammer was pretty different from what we have now.
You look at it! 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 I want all of you to look at it!
Now, Dreadanon recently made a meme going over some of the lore bits from the first edition of Warhammer, which is what inspired this video. I would say go subscribe to him, but let's be real, if you know my channel, you almost certainly know of him. This video was a lot of fun to record, you guys, and if you like it, please consider subscribing, it really helps me out. Now, when talking about the quote-unquote first edition of Warhammer 40,000, there really are two things you have to look into. That being the actual first edition, which wasn't actually called Warhammer, it was called Rogue Trader, or Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, and was honestly more like a prototype rather than a full edition, and the second edition, which can be considered the first true edition. Now, it's okay to lump these together when talking about the early lore, because they had a very similar vibe and really played off each other in regards to the theme and a lot of the characters that they had. It was only around 3rd edition that things really started to diverge, and Warhammer became the really grim, dark, sort of gothic setting that we now know and love. So as such, this video is going to go over some of the really interesting lore pieces I found when researching Rogue Trader and the 2nd edition of Warhammer. So without further ado, let's get into it, and oh my god, there is some shit to get into, boys. The first thing I do want to get into is the fact that there were far fewer factions. Namely, there was no Tau, no Necrons, and no Drukhari. Drukhari and Necrons would be introduced in the following 3rd edition to help make the setting more grimdark, and the Tau would be introduced into the 4th edition to sort of give a quote-unquote good guy race as a sort of juxtaposition. The Adeptus Mechanicus would also not really be included as a playable faction, and were instead mostly background lore for the Imperium. They would get their first codex in like the 6th or 7th edition, I think, and it was just for the Skitarii, not the whole Adeptus Mechanicus. And now, let's first get into the Imperium of Man, since I already mentioned it. The first thing to start with is Space Marines, and in their demeanor, they were very, very different. They were like knuckle-dragging morons, as someone once described them. And they were just really superstitious, had a lot of really weird rituals, and generally speaking, they behaved more like you would expect Thunder Warriors to behave as opposed to actual Space Marines. Loud, barbarian, brutal in their nature, not very mystic or very monastic in how we see them now. They were basically just like armored techno-barbarians. And even their armor itself looked quite different. Namely, basically everyone had a beak helm and this weird sort of visor style. We can actually see this pattern of armor still alive in a small part in the lore today, namely through the character of Litu, who was a prototype space marine that now protects Erda, the now exiled mother of the Primarchs. His old pattern of armor is what we used to see for Space Marines back in the 1st and 2nd editions. And Dreadanon also brings up the ritual poop eating in the meme. Yeah, that's not a joke. In the book Space Marine by Ian Watson, one of the first books ever written, that is part of the induction ceremonies for Space Marine aspirants in the Imperial Fist's Legion. They have to eat a giant buffet after they get their new stomachs in, which consists of basically rotting garbage covered in excremental sauce. Yeah, it's absolutely disgusting, and you can see where the Thunder Warrior Barbarian comparison comes into play here. I actually covered this in my first ever video on the channel, which was an interview with The Remembrancer talking about the Imperial Fists, where I go over a lot of this weird lore from the Space Marine book, and just the general bullshit of those early editions, because the Space Marines were just so weird back then, and I'm really glad they dropped it. And, talking about Space Marines, the ones that got discussed most weren't the original legions, but were a lot of successor chapters. Like the Crimson Fists, one of the first ever campaigns was actually that battle between the Orks and the Crimson Fists on their home planet. You know, the one on Rin's world where that Land Raider went crazy. As well as other chapters like the Mantis Warriors. And funny thing about the Mantis Warriors, the really big thing in this time was not the horusheresy. The horusheresy back then was just a minor lore tidbit that got thrown around as just a piece of background information as to why Chaos Space Marines exist. the big thing in these early editions was the Badab War, and eventually the Age of Apostasy, which I think is really interesting. We need some Badab War books back in the setting. And speaking of the Age of Apostasy, the Sisters of Battle were also introduced in the 2nd edition, and they were largely unchanged from what they are now, but they were actually a lot less metal. You see, everything was really heavy metal in this time because it was the 80s and early 90s, so it was definitely that era. You know, the one, that sort of Ralph Bakshi heavy metal music video era. Honestly, it's an aesthetic that I absolutely adore, but the Sisters of Battle didn't include a lot of things, such as penitent engines, or arcoflagellates, or a lot of the really messed up things they're known for nowadays. The only thing really more metal about them was the style of artwork. You know, that really old John Blanche artwork that you all know and love? Yeah, and they just generally had a lot less vehicles and a lot less weapons. They were much less fleshed out, and I think less interesting back then. However, the Imperial Guard was a little more interesting because you could actually field beastmen in the Imperial Guard. This is one thing a lot of people miss, and honestly, I think it was a cool addition. But yeah, you could have beastmen basically riding around in Land Raiders and shooting on the enemy. The Inquisition was also, I guess, taken a lot less seriously. Like, this is the area where we had the famous Inquisitor, Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau. You know, his name obviously being a mix between Obi-Wan Kenobi, Sherlock Holmes, and Detective Clouseau from the Pink Panther. This just really gives a sense as the vibe of the setting, honestly, and I think that's honestly really funny. Next up, I want to talk about the Eldar, because the Eldar in this edition actually didn't suck. I know, it's crazy, right? You see, the thing with the Eldar is they were seen as this wise race with a lot of really fast attack options. If you wanted a swift playstyle, you went for the Eldar. Nowadays, you have a lot more options with regard to Space Marines, where you can have Intercessors or White Scars or other such things to get that fast playstyle. But back in the day, that was all up to the Eldar. And one thing I should have said earlier, but I'll say it now, the Eldar at this time were a lot closer to fantasy elves in how they interacted with the Imperium and existed in general. The whole vibe of this setting was a lot closer to the fantasy roots of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. That's why Space Marines were basically like these barbarian types. This is absolutely a theme you're going to be able to recognize throughout the course of this video. And since Eldar weren't being consistently written by Gav Thorpe at this time, they were generally speaking a lot more competent seeming, as opposed to they are now where they just fuck up constantly. Yeah, you can thank Gav Thorpe for all that. And another common fantasy trope at this time was half-elves, like in D&D and other pieces of media, which is why half-Eldar were a thing. Yeah, people love to hold this one up because it's so weird to think about now. Namely, a half-Eldar named Ilya Natase was actually the chief librarian and chief astropath for the Ultramarines chapter. He was taken on Terra to be trained after he was found, and for some reason not immediately killed. He was a respected member of the chapter, and even had his own power armor. Jesus. And speaking of Eldar using power armor, you could actually equip Eldar and even Harlequins with bolt guns, and even stub guns. Harlequins, for their part, were also a lot weaker in the lore. Like, there's an instance where they kill a Genestealer cult leader, and then the other ones basically just massacre them with swords and pistols. Normally, the entire cult would have had the floor wiped with them with Harlequins in our timeline, but in that timeline, you could just be killed. Everyone was on much more even footing, as opposed to now where humans are basically like flies to Space Marines and Eldar. Oh yeah, and let's not forget Chaos Eldar. Basically, in the old lore, outcasts could eventually succumb to the lure of Slaanesh and become champions of chaos. I can't really seem to find any artwork for this, or any kind of models, but it is explicitly stated in the lore, and I'm pretty sure you could run Eldar units with the Chaos keyword. And speaking of Chaos, you could only properly run Chaos Undivided Space Marines, but you did have some rules for running them for a specific god. However, you didn't have specific units like a World Eater army or a Death Guard army. You were just running all Black Legion, but with a few distinct keywords. And you had Chaos Champions, of course, like Abaddon, and I'm pretty sure Huron Blackheart, and also Cypher. He was listed as a champion of Chaos back then that you could have at the head of your army. Another group that you could also run with the Chaos keyword was Genestealer cults. Even though they were still the Tyranids that we know, with those 4-stage life cycles and that ultimate goal of joining the hive mind, yada yada yada, if they had the root of being involved in chaos cults, you could have them effectively do both, getting the best of both worlds. Rogue Trader, you have to understand, was more like a TTRPG, kind of like Dungeons & Dragons, or the old Warhammer Fantasy TTRPGs. Tyranids, for their part, were largely unchanged. However, they were not this unstoppable horde descending on the galaxy from outside to consume it all. They were just sort of part of the galactic sphere and moving of their own accord, more slowly and more subtly, which is why they had something that the fans remember fondly, Zoats, who were a race that had been enslaved to the will of the hive mind and functioned as diplomats and emissaries. You know, it's funny, there's actually a piece of lore where a bunch of Zoats met up with some Imperial fists and tried to convince them to join the hive mind. And funnily enough, the rations for Zoats consisted of something called Zotabix, you know, like Weetabix cereal, just in case Warhammer wasn't fucking British enough for you. And the in-lore explanation for as to why they're gone is that when Tyranids became more common in the galaxy and started appearing en masse, the Zoats had realized their time was up and that they were about to be outmoded and therefore devoured. So, stage a mass slave rebellion, which went about as well as you would expect it to. And they were subsequently wiped out, except for a few remnants that have known to appeared on asteroids and in isolated space stations and that sort of thing. And now the one you've all been waiting for, squats. These are just exactly dwarves. They're literally just dwarves in space. You see, the Leagues of Votann that we have now have a bit more going on in the terms of lore department, but squats were just straight up dwarves from fantasy. One thing they did have in common with the Leagues of Votann is that they existed near the galactic core, and the heavy gravity of those planets is what gave them both long lives and their short, squat nature. Furthermore, the isolated nature of these planets, as well as their mining-reliant economy, bred hardy people with very close-knit kin groups that were hostile to outsiders and would never forget slights against them. Almost like they would keep them in a mental, but it's dwarves. They're dwarves, okay? I don't know how much more I could say it or how better I can describe it. They were fucking dwarves. There was none of that AI Votann cores, you know, the thing that give the Leagues of Votann their actual name, and instead, they were all part of the Imperium. They weren't their own separate faction. In the lore for way back when, they had initially been contacted by the Imperium during the Great Crusade, and conflict had arisen because they decided to maintain their old autonomy, and just because they were very stubborn and not prone to interacting with outsiders. However, some would be brought into the fold, eventually relations would warm, things like that. And by the time the Age of Apostasy rolled around, all squat worlds and strongholds, yes, strongholds, were brought into the fold, and squats were in full force in the Imperial Guard. However, they did maintain a level of regional autonomy. They also rode tricycles for some reason. In my opinion, that's fun, but it's just not as interesting as the Leagues of Votann now. But I guess I'm not sure, because we don't have any fucking Votann books after a year. No, I'm not letting it go. Another interesting piece of lore is that the Space Marine casualties in the initial conflicts with the squats were so high that it led to the development of Mark III power armor. And the initial squat colonies used to trade with Orks, and they had very good relations. However, eventually the Orks would betray them and start attacking, which led to relations basically deteriorating overnight and never recovering because of the long squat grudge memory thing. Yeah, about Orks, they were more or less the same. It's just that they seemed a little more diplomatic and a little more reasonable as opposed to the mindless monsters we have now. I think honestly maybe it wasn't as cool because I feel like there's something really special about Orks in the current setting of Warhammer, especially in comparison to all the other factions which are all so super serious. Wherein, here they were just another drop in the angry heavy metal bucket. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think this was just all very underbaked and too close to fantasy and not unique enough? Do you guys like this really goofy heavy metal vibe in which some of this stuff would be brought back? And out of all these things I've mentioned, which of these would you most want to see return to the setting? In my opinion, it's Chaos Eldar, just because that would be so stupid and I would love to see how that would play out in lore context. And again, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.